with us. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you for just a moment, if that's okay.
So, given that Groundhog Day was just a few days ago, and the U.S. Department of Education announced that FAFSA processing will be delayed until early March, I thought it would be apropos to mention that Punxsutawney Phil, the groundhog, didn't see his shadow, so there'll be an early spring, but the FAFSA will be delayed by 6 more weeks. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Undergraduate and graduate, oh, I'm sorry, Sheila, we forgot to mention one other thing, and that is if people have questions, we encourage them to submit them in the Q&A feature, and we will address those at the very end of this webinar. Undergraduate and graduate students should file the FAFSA to apply for financial aid from the federal and state governments and most colleges. The Student Aid Index, or the SAI, was previously known as the expected family contribution. That continues to be a measure of the family's financial strength and is calculated using the financial aid and demographic information reported on the FAFSA. About 200 mostly private colleges and universities require a supplemental form, as you know, the CSS profile. That's used for awarding their own financial aid funds. Students at these colleges must still use the FAFSA to apply for federal and state aid. Next slide, please. Total annual college costs include more than just tuition and fees. It also includes food and housing, formerly called room and board, textbooks, transportation, and miscellaneous and personal expenses. There are 4 housing allowances: on campus, at home living with family, off campus in an apartment, or on a military base. On campus yields the most financial aid. Beware of colleges underestimating allowances for some costs, such as transportation, textbooks, and personal expenses. If the figures are low, students should keep receipts and ask their financial aid office for an adjustment to the total annual cost of attendance. Financial need, which you'll see in the second to the last bullet, is a measure of how much the student and family will need to help pay for college costs after subtracting their ability to pay for college from total annual costs. The net price is the amount the student and family will have to pay for college after subtracting grants and scholarships from total annual college costs. It's known also as a discounted sticker price, how much the student and his or her family will have to pay from savings, income, and loans to cover the college costs. More than 80% of colleges practice what we call front loading of grants, where there's a better mix of grants versus loans in the student's freshman year. This means that the net price may increase significantly in subsequent years. Next slide, please. Everybody should file the FAFSA every year. Families have a tendency to underestimate their eligibility for need-based aid, and overestimate eligibility for merit-based aid. A student who is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident is eligible for federal and state student aid even if their parents are undocumented. Permanent residents and eligible non-citizens will have a green card with an 8 or 9-digit alien registration number. Next slide, please. Students can't get financial aid if they don't apply. Secondary school students in dual enrollment programs are not eligible for college financial aid. Students who already have a bachelor's degree are ineligible for the federal Pell Grant, Federal Supplemental Opportunity Grant, and Teach Grant. Students must be enrolled on at least a half-time basis in order to qualify for student loans. Plus loan borrowers must not have an adverse credit history. Eligibility for some financial aid is based on financial need, and some is based on merit. Student must also maintain what we call satisfactory academic progress, or SAP. That is, they have at least a 2.0 grade point average on a 4.0 scale, and they're on track to graduate within 150% of the normal time frame. The student must not be in default on a federal student loan or owe a refund on a federal student grant or a loan overpayment. Next slide, please. The FAFSA became available on December 31st this year. It will return to an October 1st start date in subsequent years. Students who file the FAFSA in the first 3 months from when it is released tend to get more than double the grants on average of students who file the FAFSA later. Why do we encourage students to file in the first 3 months? Some colleges have very early deadlines. More than 24 states have October through March deadlines. Each college has a fixed allocation of federal supplemental educational opportunity grant and federal work-study funding. The student should not wait until they are admitted to file the FAFSA. The FAFSA must be filed by June 30th of the award year or the last day of the academic year, whichever comes first. So in this case, it would be June 30th of 2025. Next slide, please. To apply for financial aid using the FAFSA for 24-25, the student and his or her parent, if applicable, should first get an FSA ID at studentaid.gov/FSAID. The FSA ID is a username and password that can be used to access certain U.S. Department of Education websites and to sign the online FAFSA electronically. When creating an FSA ID, it's important to list the student's name exactly as is shown on the student's Social Security card. The online FAFSA will ask for the student's first name and last name. For example, if the student's name is Susan Jones, they should report Susan Jones, not Susie Jones or S. Jones, if Susan is the student's first name on their Social Security card. The FSA ID provides self-service password retrieval by email if the user forgot their password. The FSA ID allows for name changes, for example, through marriage, without requiring a new FSA ID. It's important for the student and family to write down their user-created FSA ID username and password and the challenge questions and answers that they answer in case they cannot remember. After the student or family write down their FSA ID, we encourage them to take a picture of that information with their mobile phone or mobile device, so that way they always have it available to them. Students and families should complete and submit the 24-25 FAFSA at FAFSA.gov. The sooner it is submitted, the better, since some financial aid funds are limited and may run out. It may take less time to complete the 24-25 FAFSA due to FAFSA simplification, maybe as little as 15 to 20 minutes. After submitting the completed and electronically signed 24-25 FAFSA online, students and families should print or save a copy of the confirmation page. This page will contain a confirmation stamp showing the date and time that the FAFSA was successfully submitted. The confirmation page also includes the Student Aid Index, or SAI, and the student's estimated federal Pell Grant and federal student loan eligibility. It also lists the colleges that will receive the FAFSA. The Pell Grant is a federal grant worth $7,395 in 23-24. That's based on the student's calculated financial need and enrollment status. The government has yet to establish the maximum award for 24-25. Next slide, please. So let's talk about who is a contributor on the FAFSA. Contributor is anyone required to provide information on the student's FAFSA, such as federal tax information. Contributors include the student, the student's spouse if the student is married, and the student's parents or step-parents if the student has any step-parents. Each contributor must get their own FSA ID. The FAFSA is not considered complete until each contributor completes and submits their section of the form. If a contributor refuses to authorize the transfer of federal tax information to the FAFSA or otherwise does not complete their portion of the form, the student will be ineligible for federal student aid. Contributors must authorize the transfer of their income and tax information from the IRS to the FAFSA. Providing information on the FAFSA does not obligate the contributor to pay for college costs or to borrow for college. Here's a change. Contributors can only see their information, not information provided by another contributor. So, for example, a student cannot see information that a parent contributor provided and vice versa. Contributor information is not shared with the Department of Homeland Security or DHS or Immigration Enforcement. So let's go to the next slide and talk about which year's information is required. Assets are reported as of the date the FAFSA is filed. They're usually reported based on who owns the asset, who owns the account, not the beneficiary. However, a custodial 529 plan account where the student is both account owner and beneficiary is reported as a parental asset. Parent-owned 529 plans for siblings are no longer reported as assets on the FAFSA. That's a change. Starting with the 27-28 academic year, income reported on the FAFSA has been based on the second previous tax year, otherwise known as the prior year. For example, the 24-25 FAFSA is based on income and tax information from 2022. Most people will have filed their federal tax returns by the start date for the FAFSA. If the student or parent's federal tax returns have not been filed as of the date of the FAFSA submission, it's okay to use estimated income information. Do not substitute 2023 income information, even if it's available, even if it's lower. If a family's income has decreased, they should contact the College Financial Aid Office to ask how to file a financial aid appeal, which Mark's going to talk about in just a few minutes. Because income is reported from the prior year, in this case 2022, any distributions that are received on or after January 1st of the student's sophomore year in college will not be reported on the FAFSA if the student graduates within 4 years. If it takes the student longer to graduate, the income might have an impact. If there's any uncertainty about when the student will graduate, some families will wait until after the last FAFSA is filed or even after the student graduates before taking distributions to avoid having the distributions affect eligibility for need-based financial aid. This includes distribution from 529 college savings plans, prepaid tuition plans, Coverdale education savings accounts, and retirement plans. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mark Kantrowitz, to continue.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about who's responsible for completing the FAFSA, who's a contributor on the FAFSA, and dependency status has an impact on this. In 1992 and before, a student could be considered independent if they earned at least $4,000 a year and were not claimed on their parents' federal income tax returns for 2 years. This so-called bright line test was prone to abuse, so Congress repealed it, replacing it with the current set of dependency status questions. Now, none of the following criteria alone or in combination is sufficient for a college to perform a dependency override that changes the student from dependent to independent. So financial self-sufficiency, student doesn't live with his or her parents, the student is not claimed as an exemption on the parent's federal income tax returns, and the parents refuse to complete the FAFSA, participate in verification, pay for college, or even live in a foreign country. Now, on the right-hand side, it lists some of the criteria for independent student status. I'll explain a few of these in a little bit more detail. A veteran must have served at least 1 day on active duty, including for basic training, and have been discharged under any condition other than dishonorable. The character of service appears in box 24 of the DD 214. Possible statuses include honorable, under honorable conditions general, under other than honorable conditions, bad conduct, and uncharacterized. Dishonorable is the one that matters for federal student aid eligibility. Note that this is different than the veteran status for VA benefits. This is simply whether you're independent for federal student aid purposes. Now, ROTC students are not considered to be veterans. A student who is an orphan, in foster care, or ward of the court at any point after reaching age 13 is considered to be independent, even if they are subsequently adopted or no longer in foster care when the FAFSA is filed. A student who is adopted prior to reaching age 13 is not considered to be an orphan on the FAFSA. Now, there's often confusion between ward of the court and ward of the state. The two are not the same. Incarceration, ward of the state, does not make a student independent. With ward of the court has asserted parental authority over the student, terminating the parental rights and obligations of the student's legal parents. Ward of the state is merely incarceration of the student, where the state has custody of the student, but is not serving in a parental role. Emancipation is often confusing to families because it is mentioned as part of a divorce decree to indicate that the end of child support obligations when the child reaches the age of majority. Emancipation as part of a divorce decree does not make the student an emancipated minor, which occurs prior to reaching the age of majority. A guardianship drafted by an attorney is not sufficient for independent student status. The legal guardianship must have been determined by a court in the student's state of legal residence, so it's court ordered, not attorney. If the student's parent or step-parent is the legal guardian, that's not enough either. Legal custody does not qualify as legal guardianship. Because of recent sham guardianships, where the parents are still supporting the child, legal guardianships will undergo a greater scrutiny even if they are court ordered. Now, quick about dependency override. If the student's parents refuse to complete the FAFSA, the most aid the student will be able to get, if they are a dependent student, is the unsubsidized federal direct Stafford loan, unless the financial aid administrator performs a dependency override. The parents no longer have to cut off all financial support for the student to receive just the unsubsidized federal direct Stafford loans. Now, a dependency override can change a student's dependency status from dependent to independent, but not from independent to dependent. Independent students are not required to provide parent income, asset, and demographic information. The student cannot simply declare themselves independent if they don't satisfy any of the requirements to be automatically considered an independent student. Dependency overrides are for extreme situations such that involve an involuntary dissolution of the family, often where it is unsafe for the student to have contact with their parents. This can include incarceration or institutionalization of both parents, an abusive home environment, abandonment, parent whereabouts unknown, and death of the custodial parent. The student will need to provide independent third-party documentation, such as reports from police or law enforcement and the courts, letters from clergy, school counselors, social workers, and others who are familiar with the student situation. Now, a new change this year is college financial administrators can rely on a dependency override provided during a previous year, assuming there is no conflicting information. So this will reduce the number of times a student must ask for a dependency override, potentially to just one. Previously, students had to ask for a dependency override every single year. Now, only the FAFSA makes the question of who is your parents complicated. In addition to biological or adopted parents, parents on the FAFSA include a parent who is listed on the student's birth certificate, even if they aren't a biological or adopted parent. Same-sex parents and unmarried parents are also considered to be parents on the FAFSA. It does not matter if a parent is undocumented or a foreign national, the parent does not live in the US, or the marriage occurred outside the US. They are still considered to be a parent. A step-parent is considered to be a parent on the FAFSA only for as long as they are married to the student's custodial parent. The custodial parent is the parent responsible for completing the FAFSA. It's not necessarily the parent who has legal custody. If this parent dies or the step-parent gets divorced, the step-parent is no longer considered a parent on the FAFSA unless they have legally adopted the student. So the student may still be living with the step-parent if the custodial parent dies, but that step-parent will no longer be considered a parent for the FAFSA, federal student aid purposes. Now, parents on the FAFSA do not include grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, or cousins, even if the student is living with and supported by them. The only exception is if they have legally adopted the student. Now, students in a court-ordered legal guardianship or foster care are generally considered to be independent students. Okay. Now, what happens when the parents split? If the parents are divorced or separated but live together, they are treated as though they are married, despite being divorced, separated, or never even married. This is because the FAFSA focuses more on the student's relationship with the parents and the parents' relationship with each other. Now, the parent responsible for completing the FAFSA is the one who provided more financial support to the student during the 12 months ending on the date the FAFSA is submitted. The parent responsible for completing the FAFSA is often referred to as the custodial parent, even if they don't have legal custody. Now, if the child gets equal financial support from both parents, then it'll be the parent who has the greater income. So usually it's beneficial for the parents to figure out who's going to be the custodial parent for completing the FAFSA rather than letting it fall to chance. Now, this year, there's a new automatic tool called the IRS Direct Data Exchange. It replaces the IRS Data Retrieval Tool. And whereas the IRS Data Retrieval Tool was optional last year, the IRS Direct Data Exchange is mandatory. Almost everybody will have to complete it. There are a few exceptions that I list on the right, and those will be asked to provide income and tax information manually. For example, if the parents are currently divorced or separated, but filed a joint tax return 2 years ago, then only one parent's responsible for completing the FAFSA, but the joint income needs to be split up. And so that's why a manual reporting of income and tax information will be required by the FAFSA. Apparently, the FAFSA can't figure out how to split it up, even though the data should be possible for them to do that. Now, a benefit of this is that any data element that is transferred unmodified from a federal income tax return into the FAFSA is not subject to verification. This is going to significantly reduce the likelihood that a FAFSA will be selected for verification. Last year, about a third were selected for verification. This year, I expect that it'll be in the single digits, unless they decide to over select just to calibrate their methodology. Now, the tax deadline is April 15, and we use prior year because that's the year that you'll be filing on April 15. You can get an automatic extension of up to 6 months, which means October 15. So given the October 1st start date in typical years and December 31st this year, almost every applicant and contributor will have already filed their federal income tax returns. The only exception is members of the U.S. Armed Forces who are serving on active duty in a combat zone are not required to file federal income tax returns until 180 days after the end of their deployment. Now, if you do not use the IRS Direct Data Exchange and your FAFSA is selected for verification, you may be required to provide an IRS tax return transcript. If you are unable to use the IRS Direct Data Exchange, it is a good idea to request a tax return transcript now so you'll have it on hand just in case it is needed. The IRS will only send it to the address listed on the tax return or the records of the IRS, so you might need to file an IRS Form 8822 for a change of address, and that can take 4 to 6 weeks. Getting the IRS tax return transcript, if you file IRS Form 4506-T manually, can take up to 4 to 6 weeks. So you want to get ahead of this. Now, taxpayers who file a foreign income tax return should use the corresponding figures from the foreign income tax return, converting them into US dollars using the currency exchange rate that were in effect on the date the FAFSA is filed. You can find them on federalreserve.gov. Now, if your IRS file has been locked by the IRS because of tax identity theft, you will need to wait until the problem is resolved by the IRS to use the IRS Direct Data Exchange. Usually this doesn't take that long. Now, colleges do not see the order of the colleges listed on the FAFSA. That ended a few years ago when there was some abuse where colleges were saying, well, if you listed us fourth or later, you probably don't want to go to our college, so we're not going to admit you. That kind of abuse was not appropriate, and the U.S. Department of Education responded by stopping the sharing of that information with the colleges. But there is still some impact of the order of colleges on the FAFSA. You should always list an in-state public college first on the FAFSA to ensure that you qualify for state grants, because in some states, they rely on their state being listed first to consider you for state grants. After that in-state public college, list the colleges in order of the financial aid deadline to ensure that they receive your FAFSA information by their priority deadline. This year, the number of colleges on the FAFSA has increased from 10 to 20 on the online FAFSA. You really shouldn't be applying to more than 20 colleges, but if you are, you can list more than 20 colleges by deleting the old colleges and adding the new colleges after the old colleges have received your FAFSA information. This is called the ISER, Institutional Student Information Record. When they receive the ISER, it means that you can then delete them. And when you receive your FAFSA submission summary, which was previously known as the Student Aid Report, or SAR, that's an indication that the colleges have received your financial information. And in addition to using the FAFSA website to add more colleges, students can add colleges by calling the Federal Student Aid Information Center at 1-800-4FED-AID, 1-800-433-3243, and using the data release number, DRN, from the FAFSA submission summary. These days, though, the Federal Student Aid Information Center is completely clogged with an abundance of calls. It might be better to use the FAFSA website to do that addition, but you won't be able to make corrections like adding or deleting colleges until sometime in March, assuming there are no further delays. Now, the federal school code on the FAFSA is not the same as the school codes used on the SAT, ACT, or CSS profile. You can usually find a college's federal school code on the college's website or on the FAFSA's federal school code search tool, which is built into the FAFSA. I'll review a couple common errors on the FAFSA that we've noticed over the years. Many errors occur when the parents create an FSA ID for the student or vice versa, because the parents might swap the student's social security number with their own or the social security number of a sibling, or start the FAFSA with their own FSA ID instead of the student's FSA ID, and it's the student who's applying for financial aid, not the parent. And you'll complete the FAFSA and suddenly you'll realize that you did it inverted. If you enter cents in the FAFSA, you will increase the dollar amounts by a factor of 100, because the FAFSA ignores cents and decimal points. And so if you write $100.01, you just entered $10,001. It is important to use the actual Social Security card or alien registration card when filling out the FAFSA, instead of using your memory, make sure that your name and social security number are exactly as they appear on the social security card. Typos in the social security number are actually quite common. As much as 5% of the time, people make a digit transposition or other errors on the social security number. Like they might write a 7 instead of a 4 because they're adjacent keys on a keypad. So you need to double check the numbers. And the name on your social security card is your legal name. You need to use the same name as David mentioned earlier on the FAFSA. Don't use a middle name or a nickname instead of your first name. Double check the date of birth, especially for swapping the month and day or an error in the year of birth. You'd be surprised, but people don't remember their actual birthday. It's only 1% or 2% of the time, but it does happen. Now, tax preparers sometimes claim head of household status, even when the taxpayer is ineligible because it can yield a lower tax liability. If you claim head of household status, there will be additional scrutiny, and the College Financial Aid Administrator may require you to file an amended federal income tax return in order for them to approve your FAFSA. Now, qualified retirement plans include a 401k, 403b, IRA, Roth IRA, Roth 401k, SEP, Simple, KEOG, and pension plans. The family must live in the family home for it to be excluded as an asset. The family's share of the net worth of other real estate, such as investment real estate or a timeshare, is reported as an asset on the FAFSA. Net worth is the current market value minus any debt that is secured by the asset. So if you use a home equity loan on your family home to buy a vacation home or investment real estate, that vacation home is not, that mortgage is not secured by that vacation home, so it doesn't reduce the net worth of that vacation home. 529 plans owned by a dependent student or a dependent student's parent are reported as a parent asset on the FAFSA. 529 plans where a sibling is the beneficiary are for the first time not reported as assets on the FAFSA, even if they are owned by the parent. Grandparent-owned 529 plans are not reported as an asset on the FAFSA, and distributions from grandparent-owned 529 plans or aunt to uncle or other people other than the student or parent own the plan are also not reported on the FAFSA for the first time. So the number one error is failing to file the FAFSA. This chart shows you the number of Pell Grant eligible students who didn't file the FAFSA each year. This is every 4 years, based on my analysis of federal government data. So more than 2 million people didn't file the FAFSA, but would have qualified for a Pell Grant. And of them, 1.3 million would have qualified for the maximum Pell Grant. So they left money on the table because they didn't file the FAFSA. Now, to increase financial aid eligibility, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The slide is mainly for your edification. The main methods are, I mean, if you artificially increase your income, you're going to decrease your aid eligibility, so don't do that. Don't realize capital losses, don't exercise stock options, defer bonuses, don't take distributions from your retirement plan. Assets have less of an impact on aid eligibility, but they still have an impact. So don't have higher reportable assets. So if you have money in the bank and you use it to pay down your credit card debt the day before you file the FAFSA, then your reportable money in the bank account will be lower. Similarly for paying down auto loans and mortgages, mortgages on the primary place of residence. If you're this year, 401k matching contributions and your contributions are not going to be reported on the FAFSA, whereas IRA contributions will still be. And the reason is because the former is not included on federal income tax returns, the latter is. But if you maximize your retirement plan contributions through your employer to a 401k or 403b, that is going to reduce your income on the FAFSA and potentially help you qualify for more financial aid. If you have money in the student's name, and we're not talking about a 529 plan, but like a UGMA or UTMA custodial bank account, spend down the student's money before touching the parent's money. You can also spend unnecessary expenses. You can't simply put the money in the parent's name because legally that money is the child's, but there are ways to shift it. Um, and when a dependent student becomes independent, parent information is required on the FAFSA. That can lead to more aid eligibility, not always, but sometimes. And if the parents are divorced or separated, choose the custodial parent carefully. There is no verification that this parent provides more financial support, but if the college learns that they provide more financial support, that they will have an issue. But to the extent that you can choose the parent that has the lower income to be the one who completes the FAFSA, that will lead to more financial aid. I wrote a best-selling book about how to appeal for more college financial aid. I'd like to point out the URL at the bottom is there is a free tip sheet available on that page. And that goes over the basics about how to appeal for more college financial aid. Not everybody who should appeal does appeal, so I encourage more people to appeal for more financial aid. The gist is, are there any special circumstances? And these can be differences from changes from income in the base year, the prior year to the current, or anything that distinguishes your family's financial circumstances from that of the typical family. That could be high unreimbursed medical or dental expenses, high dependent care costs for a special needs child, and so on. And if you appeal and the college approves the appeal, then it may lead to differences on the FAFSA. Like you can't change your income from that prior year to the most recent year, but the college financial aid administrator can. And so if you've lost a job, had a pay cut, or didn't have a bonus this year, let the college know and they can make an adjustment, and that's the most common adjustment that they will make. I'm going to skip over this so that we have more time for questions. I'm just talking about verification of FAFSA data, and I'll leave this slide up um, while we switch to the question and answers. The next slide is just a thank you slide, so I'll leave this one up.
Are there any questions that you might have about the new FAFSA or challenges you're facing in working with students in regard to the 24-25 FAFSA? We'd be glad to answer those. If you want to unmic yourself, I'm sorry, if you want to unmute yourself, we'd be glad to try and answer those for you.
Don't see any questions in the question and answer, the Q&A thing yet, but one of the things I think people were asking about before is how will the colleges, with the release date changing so much, how will that affect the students and how does it affect the colleges?
Right. So in a normal year, the FAFSA starts on October 1st, and the colleges start getting the ICERs, their copy of the FAFSA data, within a few days. And so this has already affected students who applied early action or early decision, because normally you'd get your admissions decision, and at the same time or a few days later, you get your financial aid offer. And early decision is a binding commitment, as you know, but if the college is unaffordable, that's one of the situations in which they will release you from that obligation. And I've been telling families, don't accept the early decision offer of admission until you know how much financial aid you're going to get, because you won't know if it's affordable. And this means that they're going to still apply regular decision to other colleges. Now, there is a handful of colleges that use the CSS profile form for their own financial aid. And because that hasn't suffered from the same problems as the FAFSA, they can use the EFC on that that's reported by the CSS profile as a proxy for the student aid index. It's not perfect, but these are also among the wealthier colleges, and they can use their own resources as a backstop in case their estimate of, say, Pell Grant eligibility is incorrect. They also tend to have fewer Pell Grant recipients, so it's not as big of a deal. Another method that some colleges have been using to estimate the award package is to ask the students for their student aid index that was reported to them on the FAFSA completion page. But not every student has seen that, because if the parents completed their part of the FAFSA after the student completed their part, then the student may not necessarily see the FAFSA completion page and therefore not see their student aid index. They'll see it when they get their FAFSA submission summary, which won't be until March, sometime in March, if everything goes properly. And as we know, this year has been a kind of difficult year for the FAFSA. And some colleges are using income and other information to try to ballpark estimate the aid eligibility. But for many colleges, they're just going to have to wait until March when they get the FAFSA information. Now, the U.S. Department of Education has said that they will start issuing, sending this information to the colleges in early March, in the first half of March. Well, my read of that is that means that you're not going to get them until March 15. And it'll only start on March 15. They may be parceled out over the rest of the month or even in April. So the colleges won't be able to generate financial aid offers, maybe not until late March or early April, if we're lucky. Might not get it all done until May. I mean, it takes a lot of effort. Now, there are two types of colleges, those who have automated packaging and those who have manual packaging. The ones with automated packaging might be able to turn this around within a few weeks. The ones with manual packaging, it's going to be a lot of stress on them to get it done. And then there's all the appeals that are going to come in when the aid offer isn't what the family expected, especially if families who had 2 children in college last year and on the same this year, or more children, their aid offer is probably going to go down and they're going to appeal, and the colleges are going to be overwhelmed with the volume of calls in such a tight period of time. Some colleges have already pushed back the decision day from May 1st to June 1st. Some are just playing it by ear. And because who knows, saying the FAFSA might not actually have all the problems fixed by March. And we are still seeing students who have undocumented parents having problems with the parents completing the FAFSA. And some have switched to using the paper or PDF form, but those won't be processed until the online applicants are all processed. So it's a real mess this year. The best advice I have is to be patient. Things will get fixed at some point. Hopefully nobody loses any aid because of this.
Thanks, Mark. We have some other questions that have come in. One question that came in kind of offline is that a lot of parents are noticing there's a difference between the results of a net price calculator and what they're getting in a preliminary award in terms of the in terms of the student aid index. Do you want to address why there might be some differences between the results of a net price calculator and the amount that colleges are showing on a tentative or conditional award?
Well, the conditional award is an estimate, and it may have different figures than the net price calculator. The net price calculator is based on prior year financial aid information, and so the FAFSA has changed enough that the net price calculator will need to be updated, and many colleges haven't updated them. Also, one thing that I forgot to mention is the inflation adjustments. The reason why the Department of Education is delaying the FAFSA until March is partly due to inflation adjustments. The FAFSA Simplification Act, which was part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, provided tables from 2020 for the financial aid formula, but then required the U.S. Department of Education to make adjustments for inflationary changes from then to the present, from April of 2020 to April of the most recent year, April 2023. that was about 18%, 18.3%, 18.2%, somewhere around there. And that's that the income protection allowance in particular shelters a portion of the family income, and an 18% increase in that would shelter a lot more income, both of the student and parents. And I and others started warning the Department of Education about this back in May of last year when the draft financial aid formula was released without these adjustments. And the department in December said that they weren't going to make the adjustments this year, but instead in 2025-26 FAFSA. But then I published information where I actually implemented, with and without adjustments, the inflation adjustments, the financial aid formula. And I showed that while low-income students might not have a change, middle-income students is about a $1,600 change in the student aid index, and high-income students average around a $4,600 change in the student aid index. That's enough to maybe not affect federal aid eligibility, though I think for middle income families, some would actually be at the edge of qualifying for the Pell Grant, but it does have an impact on the college's own financial aid funds. And so the U.S. Department of Education finally decided to make this change, but they're saying it's going to take them a month and a half to actually implement it. I'm not sure why it's changing the numbers. I offered to give them the new numbers, and they already published the new numbers, but apparently the implementation is not modular, so they have to recompile all the code behind the FAFSA and make the changes. Plus, I think that they may be still trying to fix problems with the FSAID, especially for undocumented students, but even, well, undocumented parents. The student's a U.S. citizen, the parents aren't. But that's probably a good reason for the delay is that there are so many bugs and they hadn't adequately tested before they went live with their quote unquote soft launch.
Mark, we've got a couple of other questions that have come through. First, aren't there FAFSA specialists being trained to help families? Second part of that same question, how do we access this list of people?
Right. So I'm not sure who you're referring to by FAFSA specialists. The U.S. Department of Education is running some webinars for financial aid professionals to introduce them to the FAFSA. We have, you and I have been helping in California, where we've been training trainers to for the California Cash for College program, and there might be some in Michigan. But one change this year is that paid financial aid consultants. So someone tells you how to answer and what to answer on a specific question on the FAFSA. If they cannot charge you a fee for that. They might, if they're a federal income tax return preparer and they happen to give you the corresponding numbers for the FAFSA, that's fine. But if they are a financial aid consultant, they cannot charge you for preparing the FAFSA on your behalf.
Mark,
So that might.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
There are also College Goal Sunday sessions being offered in states across the country. I would suggest you Google the term College Goal Sunday. You'll see a list of where those sites are. Those are free services provided by financial aid specialists. I'm going to go to the next question, Mark.
Okay, before you jump to that,
I'm sorry.
NCAN, the National College Attainment Network, has a website called formyourfuture.org,
Yes.
and they've got some information about College Goal Sunday programs there as well.
Okay, next question, Mark. Are colleges prepared to answer questions or provide workarounds for issues that parents and students can't get answers from federal student aid? For example, what to do if a parent has an international address and can't proceed with the FAFSA due to an error message? The comment here is the FAFSA folks don't answer the phone or reply to messages.
Right. They've got millions of people calling and they don't have enough people to call and respond in a timely manner. So the college financial aid administrators can answer some questions, especially since they don't have the FAFSAs now to process to create your financial aid offers. So They have a little bit more free time now, so they might be able to answer your questions. To answer the specific question, some people have reported problems. There's when creating an FSA ID, there is an address field of the form, and some people have said they put in information and they can't get past it. Their address or their telephone number. We know that the FAFSA, the FSA ID, cannot currently handle country codes. So if you have a telephone number that is outside the US, don't put it in, just leave the field blank. But if you're still not getting past that field of the form, put a blank address in instead of entering your address. You'll be able to get past it, and then you'll be able to update it later with your address. This isn't a perfect solution because if you're not a U.S. citizen or you're undocumented, there is a secondary process involving 1 to 4 knowledge-based questions, and they need not just your name but your address in order to trigger the appropriate questions. So if you complete it without your address, you might not be presented with those knowledge-based questions. And then you have to call the Federal Student Aid Information Center to get the next step in the process, which is there's an attestation form and there's certain documentation you'd have to provide copies of. Something else that you can try, and this has worked a few times, is rather than cutting and pasting your address into the field, try typing your address into the field. Sometimes that will work because there might be hidden characters that, like accents and such, that the FAFSA currently can't handle. Also, I've sometimes seen cases where it's either the student started the FAFSA or the parent started the FAFSA and then they get stuck. Try it the opposite way. So the student would have to go in and delete the FAFSA and then have the parents start the FAFSA and then invite the student, see if that works. Or if the student started the FAFSA, or that the parents started FAFSA, try it the other way, see if that works. Sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't.
Thanks, Mark. I think we have time for one more question. What you were talking about undocumented students.
Well, I wasn't.
I'm sorry, Mark. Here, my power just went out. Can you speak further about the issues students with an undocumented parent are facing and how that can be resolved? What have others been experiencing? I have one student, this person says, with a similar scenario who's having issues. Can you address that?
Okay, so it's not the student who is undocumented, it's the parents who are not undocumented.
Undocumented parents,
Right.
I'm sorry.
A student who is a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, excuse me, is eligible for federal student aid regardless of the citizenship or immigration status of the parent. It's part of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot of legal precedent for this. So the U.S. Department of Education has to fix these problems because they cannot have a process that denies the student aid eligibility simply because their parents aren't U.S. citizens or undocumented. Now, the FSA ID was supposed to be available to people who are not U.S. citizens or undocumented this year for the first time, but they've been having some problems. Some people have succeeded in getting them, but some people haven't. And so it's a real challenge. And even though they could file the FAFSA on paper, that's going to cause delays because the paper processing of the paper FAFSAs will be at the end once the U.S. Department of Education is done with everyone else. The issues and one set of issues involves the parent may have been working using a social security number that is not their own. And the IRS associates that social security number with the parent's address. There are two entities here, the IRS and the Social Security Administration. When the family starts completing the FAFSA or they try to obtain an FSA ID for the undocumented parent, that IRS says, we have information that you have a social security number, and then they're not being allowed to go forward. And if they were to use that social security number, which they can't, but if they were to try it, it would fail the data match with the Social Security Administration because their address and their identity, their name is not associated with that social security number. Now, in some cases, if the undocumented parent has a work-only social security number, in some cases they've been able to use that. They haven't been able to use an ITIN in lieu of the social security number. There have been reports that some people have succeeded in entering a social security number of all sixes, and this is different than the old 000 method of last year, which no longer works, and they substituted a checkbox for that. But a number that begins with 666 is used for the to create a temporary social security number for someone from the Federated States of Micronesia or Republic of Palau. These are U.S. territories, so that might work, though it might cause problems later. And there's also a problem of mixed status families where one parent is a U.S. citizen and the other parent is undocumented. The U.S. citizen parent provides a social security number, and then it doesn't offer the option, the checkbox for the other parent to say, I don't have a social security number. So someone implemented the code badly, made an assumption that they shouldn't have. U.S. Department of Education has to fix these. There is a web page where they are listing all the outstanding issues. It keeps on getting longer and longer. And to date, I think only 3 of the issues have been fixed. But that's probably one of the reasons why the FAFSA is being delayed until March, so that they have time to try to fix all these problems.
Thanks, Mark. I think we're almost out of time, Sheila. I just wanted to thank MACAC for inviting us to do this presentation. One final comment. If you have students who are trying to reach the Federal Student Aid Information Center, they should call that 1-800 number that's up on the screen. The best time to get through, because I've been working with students, is when they open first thing in the morning. Sheila, I'm going to turn it back over to you or Hannah, and thank you for including us in your webinar today.
Thank you so much, both of you. The webinar is recorded and it will be posted on the MACAC website along with the PowerPoint. And once again, Dave and Mark, we really appreciate your expertise on all this. It's very complicated. we love it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.